Good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Ogsberry, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Western Governors Association, a fiercely bipartisan organization representing the governors of the 22 westernmost states and territories. It's my honor to welcome you all today for our webinar, COVID-19 Economic Impacts and Mitigation in Rural Communities, Part 2, State and Local. This program is being presented by WGA in connection with Reimagining the Rural West, the Chair's initiative of WGA Chair and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. It's designed to complement the highly informative webinar that WGA produced last week that engaged several of our federal partners to discuss COVID-19 economic impacts and mitigation in rural communities. Today, we're pleased to present the perspectives and ideas of several state and local partners on the same topic. The Reimagining the Rural West initiative is centered on three pillars: economic opportunity, connectivity, and community. All three of these pillars have been rocked by the current public health crisis. Governors, of course, have been on the front lines in the battle against COVID-19, taking bold and unprecedented actions to contain the spread of the virus while at the same time working tirelessly to keep supply lines open and to deliver protective gear and equipment and to keep their states running. And now they're starting to look beyond the horizon of the pandemic to consider strategies for reopening business and kickstarting their stalled economies. Our panelists today have thought deeply about the issues of economic mitigation, and we're so grateful that they've agreed to share their insights and perspectives. To moderate the panel, I'm proud to introduce one of WGA's own, Lauren Donino. Lauren is a policy advisor with WGA who has been WGA's team lead in designing and executing the Reimagining the Rural West initiative. This is a sprawling and ambitious initiative that has lots of moving parts. It's really an all-hands project for WGA staff. Lauren has done a fantastic job as our quarterback in this effort, and she's tremendously qualified to lead today's discussion. So, Lauren, I'm pleased to pass the program on to you now.
Thank you very much, Jim. As Jim said, we're very excited for today's webinar, and I'm just going to go over a couple of technical details, and then we'll get going. So the format of today's webinar will be presentations from each of our panelists, followed by moderated discussion. And we encourage all of our attendees to participate in the moderated discussion by submitting questions using the attendee chat function on the left of your screen. You can submit questions at any time, and they will be collected and incorporated into the moderated discussion portion of the webinar. In addition, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted at westgov.org later this afternoon. You'll also be able to find the presenter slides there. If you have any technical questions or issues while the webinar is underway, you can also use the attendee chat and we'll try and help you out. All right, so throughout the Reimagining the Rural West initiative, WGA has examined how rural communities can insulate themselves from economic shocks, prepare for disasters, and build in resilience. But the current crisis is beyond what any community would have prepared for. Today's webinar will explore the road ahead as rural communities navigate the economic fallout and position themselves for recovery. We'll discuss what steps can be taken at the regional, state, and local level. I'm very excited to learn more from our panel of experts who hail from across the West, including Oregon, Colorado, and Washington. Our first speaker, Eric Holdeman, is a nationally known emergency manager. He has worked in emergency management at the federal, state, and local government levels. Today, he serves as the director of the Center for Regional Disaster Resilience, which is part of the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. He's a prolific writer, authoring numerous articles for professional journals and opinion pieces for local, regional, and national newspapers, including the Washington Post. He is a contributing writer and senior fellow for Emergency Management magazine. Additionally, he is a regular columnist for the International Association of Emergency Managers. Eric has the United States' most popular blog on the topics of emergency management and homeland security, and I have found it personally to be a very good resource during this crisis. And you can check it out at www.disaster-zone.com. Eric, we're pleased to learn more.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and welcome everybody from Western Washington, where I'm at. And pleased to just jump right in to this. My background is not economic development. I'm an emergency manager that has functioned at different levels of government. So as I look at this, it's a different type of disaster, certainly radically different in nature from natural disasters with physical damages. And I think one of the things to consider as the federal agencies respond to this and state emergency management is involved with this, they're used to the programs that have public assistance for governments, repairing damages in many respects to public property, individual assistance to help individuals with damages, physical damages, and then the SBA's, Small Business Administration's normal role is low-interest loans to qualifying businesses. And, of course, we've seen in the last 3 weeks almost three-quarters of an annual federal budget be reappropriated in successive CARES Act and congressional legislation. So what I call it is they're providing CPR in the form of money for people, businesses, and the economy in general, just to try to keep things moving along and sustained. So what's needed? And I can't emphasize enough the need for speed now. Bob, I didn't steal one of your slides, but you've got one coming up where you talk about you have the response and then restoration phase. And the idea, the concept, doctrine is immediately in the disaster response, you break out a few people, start working on recovery. And my observation is that the agencies I'm familiar with on the emergency management side have been slow out of those starting blocks. The other thing I've observed from other mega disasters, Hurricane Katrina and the like, is sometimes people are waiting for a grand plan to develop. And we can't wait because the organizations, small businesses, just won't survive. So we need to act locally, and people need hope. They need to see action in order to be able to hang on. Certainly, I've observed many times this paralysis by analysis, trying to figure out what is the right measure. And I don't advocate throwing Jell-O up on the wall or spaghetti and seeing what sticks, but a variety of measures, not one single solution, is the best approach. And we have to be sure that we aren't studying the issue to death, ending up with making an autopsy on small business, medium-sized business, instead of a rescue. And I'd just like to highlight the fact that multiple academic studies have shown that in natural disasters, 40% of small businesses that close their doors for 3 weeks will eventually fail. And certainly, we're in this multi-week, maybe multi-month environment. Hopefully the CARES Act legislation will help sustain beyond that normal 3 weeks. So our Pacific Northwest region recommendation for the path forward, and this is based on our previous recovery planning and recovery exercises that we've done. And typically these are centered on physical damages, but we've also done pandemic flu planning and pandemic flu exercises. And so you do need an evaluation of the needs and capabilities of the business sector in order to set recovery priorities. Amending regulatory code compliance and permitting the issues that slow the spread of reopening the businesses is key. We need to connect businesses with employees, goods, and markets. And a lot of disruption has been happening and continues to happen. I think we're going to see continued fallout just as we've seen with the oil markets. You need to retain your state, county, cities, largest, highest profile businesses. And for many small rural locations, there may not be one single business, but if there is, that is the moneymaker. That's the major employer for them, and retaining them, keeping them afloat is critically important. And then communicating the strength of the local economy as a recovery. We have to keep talking about what's being done. You can't say it just once. People don't hear single messages, and the best people will be out there doing that. our local elected officials and chambers of commerce. And we see key sectors being across and into the rural areas, especially tourism, health, agriculture, education, and even the gig economy. And last slide here is we've been advocating to the various congressional delegations across all of PNWR's 5 Northwest states the need for a stimulus funding package for states and cities, because that money still hasn't been appropriated. We see a need for assistance to trade sector industries to include promotion of their programs, resources to support firms to rebuild their supply chains. There is an opportunity for funding towards research and development that will be needed. And there are education incentives that can help create domestic supply chains. For instance, we think there'll be an onshoring of medical PPE that we've seen in such short supply in the future, and so that's an opportunity smaller communities, small manufacturers could jump on. And lastly, a focus on tourism recovery that has both the urban and the rural benefits and is a lifeline for much of our small to medium-sized communities in the West. And with that, I look forward to any questions and also hearing from the other presenters this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric, for that quick overview. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Bob Parker, the Executive Director of the University of Oregon's Institute for Policy, Research, and Engagement, or IPRE. Over the last 30 years, Bob has managed more than 500 policy and planning analysis projects with communities and state officials throughout Oregon. IPRE is known widely throughout Oregon as one of the state's critical policy analysis resources, connecting expertise of university faculty and students with communities and agencies. These relationships, as well as the vast policy analysis experience, help IPRE provide service to communities and organizations throughout Oregon. Bob is also Program Director for the EDA University Center for Economic Development at the University of Oregon. Thanks, Bob. We look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for inviting me. Greetings from Eugene, Oregon. Just a little bit of context here. I work in a research center that has for decades provided assistance to communities throughout the state of Oregon, and we have several programs to that effect. We have a AmeriPort program called Resource Assistance for Rural Environments, where we place about 30 people out in rural Oregon communities to work on community and economic development activities. We've had our Oregon Partnership for Disaster Resilience for 20 years now, where we've been working with communities around pre-disaster mitigation planning, business continuity, and in the past decade, increasingly around economic resilience. And finally, as Lauren mentioned, we have our EDA University Center for Economic Development. So we work in the space of economic development and disaster. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a framework that we put together for recovery in Oregon. And this came out of several comments or conversations that we were having in Oregon. Governor Brown tasked the regional solutions coordinators with establishing economic recovery teams to basically deal with coronavirus. And what we were hearing in the initial calls was what you would expect. There was a lot of discussion about immediate response, how to get money out and so on. And as Eric mentioned, we felt strongly that somebody needed to carve off a space to have a conversation about longer-term recovery, which is consistent with the way emergency management works. So we started with sort of an aspirational or appreciative question. Imagine Oregon's economic development community embraces a consistent, holistic strategy to coordinate the implementation of economic recovery efforts across lines, public, private, local, and state, urban, and rural. What benefits would that bring, and what organizational framework would support it? Our observation of the economic development ecosystem in Oregon is that it is comprised of a set of loosely networked organizations with different functions where nobody can tell anybody else what to do. So the challenge is getting everybody aligned and moving in the same direction. We've seen an unprecedented level of coordination in the early weeks of the response here. So we're looking at this in terms of phases, and there's a lot of different constructs that are sitting out there right now, but we characterize it as a shutdown. So this would be the shock period, and we think this will last through June optimistically, but it may last longer depending on a number of variables. And then there'll be a reopening phase, and there's been a lot of press about reopening, a lot of pressure to reopen at this point. And then after the federal money dries up, the emergency operations centers close down, and there's a vaccination, we'll go through a recovery period, and it's likely that will last potentially years or even a decade or more. It's really difficult to say right now. So we think about resilience and recovery trajectories. The initial condition of the community or our state, our nation's economy is very strong going into this. We have an event that's unprecedented. We're at the point of the shock, and at this point what we're trying to do is to establish mechanisms that will increase community and economic resilience. And we'll be working around the state on those things over the coming months and years. Eric mentioned this particular slide about disaster leadership. Right now we're in the first responder wave, and everybody has been focused on how to keep things going to the extent that's possible, how to move federal money into communities. We're moving into the continuity wave, and continuity in this instance, I think, means a different equilibrium than what we've experienced before. And eventually we'll move into the recovery wave. And so part of what we were trying to do with this framework was to get people thinking about how do we jump forward or establish the framework to move to these different leadership waves. So we recommended an organizational structure for recovery in Oregon that recommends establishing separate linked organization structures that lead response continuity and recovery efforts. So the response efforts are well underway here. Some of the groups that we've been working with are looking at continuity and recovery, but they're in the very early phases of sorting through what that's going to look like. The second one is around leadership. So clearly centralizes regional leadership for continuity and recovery efforts that report up to the state disaster recovery coordinator. So Oregon recently adopted a statewide recovery plan. The governor is yet to implement it, but we think that will be coming soon, and having a clear state guidance on how to proceed, I think, will be important. Activate state recovery, economic recovery support functions, establish group mandated to plan for continuity recovery, convene regional economic continuity recovery teams to get this work moving as soon as possible, and then develop a clear playbook of actions to coordinate efforts of all actors. So the playbook is, I think, a big question mark for us right now. The environment is evolving so rapidly. So one way to think about this is in an incident command perspective, and what we were advocating in the white paper we produced is that economic development professionals become familiar with how emergency operations work. So within emergency operations centers or incident command, there is an economic or business recovery branch to that. And economic development specialists need to coordinate and be aware of what those groups are doing. Basically, what we're suggesting is that a separate branch gets set up for continuity recovery, that has a leadership team. I fully support Eric's comments about analysis paralysis. There's a lot of information that can be worked through, but the environment's going to be evolving so rapidly that I think that agile strategies will be necessary to keep up with the changes. We also identified some priorities to move forward. So there's some interesting questions that emerge out of this. So assessing industry and economic development challenges, what recovery outcomes should we be striving for? And at some level, just having safe, healthy communities may be a baseline for us. What activities will have the biggest impact in economic development? How do we most efficiently and productively use the funds that are coming down? What priorities should exist to support the most impactful recovery outcomes? So how do we prioritize those things and who makes the decisions on those? How can local governments deploy federal, state, and local investments in a coordinated effort to achieve agreed upon recovery outcomes? And then how do we mobilize networks for action? Those would all be part of your incident action planning process. So where do we start? We continue response, get the federal money out. It seems pretty likely there'll be another round of federal funds that come through this. Mobilize for continuity and recovery action. Sorry about that. Map your assets, analyze the risk, and apply principles of agile strategy. So typical economic development, comprehensive economic development strategic plans, I think, are not going to be particularly effective in this environment. We think that you'll need to be considering shorter rounds of, say, do cycles where you quickly identify actions, assess what happened, make adjustments, and then move forward, and as Eric said, get started. So that is the end of my comments.
Great. Thank you so much for that overview. Next, I would like to introduce Kate Guibert, who is the Rural Prosperity Manager for the Department of Local Affairs Colorado Resilience Office. Kate provides support, resources, and capacity to communities looking to build economic resilience to change and disruptions. Prior to her role at the state, Kate worked as the Resilience Program Manager for the City of Boulder, where she implemented strategies to empower the city to be adaptive and nimble to change. Kate has a Master's of Public Administration from the University of Colorado at Denver with an environmental policy management and law emphasis. Kate?
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to just start by giving a little bit of context on the Colorado Resiliency Office, which is a unique office for many state governments. So the Colorado Resilience Office is really set up to, on the front end, help communities be proactive, take a long-term view about change and disruption, and kind of build strategies to address some of what might be coming. And we look across 6 sectors, so health and social, natural environment, infrastructure, economic, really take a full system perspective as to what disruption might look like. Then on the back end, after an event or some kind of disruption has happened, we're the office that really steps in and provides the long-term recovery support to communities across the state. So because of this, we've really been thinking about recovery since day one of this event. And I'm actually just going to highlight, I'm going to take a different approach and view here, which is kind of the tactical and community response that we've been involved in. And one of the things that we did really early on was we formed a Rural Community Adaptation and Futures Committee. And this group consisted of both state agencies as well as many local experts who were either from chambers of commerce or from universities, people who worked in economic development, to really help think about what was going to be needed in kind of the stabilization phase as well as the recovery phase. And this group really does get a little bit more in the weeds. So, for example, last week we were talking about kind of a shift in the public-private paradigm, and we're seeing a lot of success in Colorado right now where communities are really letting their business community lead in some of the response and recovery efforts. And so based on that, we're trying to produce some kind of best practice templates from successes that we're seeing in how communities have been responding. And then this week we spoke about kind of marketing and messaging, particularly in Colorado, which has a heavy tourism economy that's based on outdoor recreation, that as we start to reopen, many of our communities are going to be at different points in their willingness and ability to handle visitation. So how do we message those various levels of readiness when people might think that they're ready to road trip to Colorado? So we're talking about how we have a dashboard that indicates county by county where communities are at in terms of their ability to accept visitation, while at the same time communities need to continue to promote their county and their communities while saying maybe we don't want you to come right now. So it's a really interesting place for our communities to be. The second thing I want to highlight is we created what we're calling our recovery starter kit, to the point that we're trying to get information out quickly. We're trying to prompt these conversations to begin, but the world changes every day, so we have to enable space for those shifts. So this recovery starter kit focuses on a few different things. A, for communities just to put together a recovery and resilience team, and that this team's going to look a lot different than maybe our traditional recovery teams. This might not be led by emergency management. In fact, it likely won't. It will likely be led by local government, possibly economic development professionals, other local conveners like community foundations. This is really going to be kind of a public health and a community and economic development recovery. So just encouraging communities to put those teams in place, encouraging communities to really talk about what their vision for their community is on the other side of this. Just because we're going through this disruption right now doesn't mean that we all don't still have hopes and dreams. It doesn't mean that the priorities that we had prior to this event are still important. It just means that they may have shifted some, and we need to think about different pathways to get to the things that were important to us. So identifying those things from the onset. This starter kit also talks about doing some kind of high-level scenario planning, thinking about different versions of the future and what are the opportunities. We do keep trying to talk about what are the opportunities. There is a silver lining in this, and that we are working together differently than ever before, taking a much more integrative approach to things. There's an opportunity, especially in rural Colorado, to kind of accelerate forward some of our economies who have been wanting to attract location-independent workers. We're learning really quickly how to do remote work in these communities. So trying to pick up on some of those things that might be something that helps us accelerate our futures in these communities. The other thing we include in the starter kit is actually Richard Florida's 10-point economic action plan. For those of you who have not seen this, I think this is a great resource to just start the conversation about what are some potential areas to think about recovery. So as an example, he calls out, protecting the arts and creative economies, and he then calls out some strategies in which to do that. He calls out protecting our main streets and ensure that they survive, and calls out strategies to do that. So for communities who are just starting to have this conversation, I think it's a really good resource. So I'm gonna leave it at those kind of few tactical things that we're looking at as an office.
That sounds good. Thank you, Kate. That was a great start. All right, so then our last speaker is Jessica Metta, who has been with Mid-Columbia Economic Development District since 2008, first as a project manager and then as deputy director starting 2017, and now as the executive director since March. Jessica has a master's in urban and regional planning from Portland State University and was elected in 2018 as a city councilor for the city of Hood River. Jessica, take it away.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for the invitation to be here. Mid-Columbia Economic Development District. So I guess to just step back, I am providing some local perspective on how we are implementing a response and recovery for our region. Mid-Columbia Economic Development District, or MCED is how we say our acronym, serves 3 counties in Oregon and 2 in Washington. We're about an hour east of the Portland metro area and are known as a tourist destination with the scenic and outdoor recreation draw that is the Columbia River Gorge. But the region has also worked really hard over the last few decades to focus on diversifying the economy. So besides tourism and our very important economic base in agriculture, we also have a strong tech industry, a number of food and beverage manufacturers, also key sectors in healthcare, wood products, and renewable energy. What's also important is that our region has a long history of working together. MCED itself has existed for over 50 years now in recognition from our 5 counties of how closely this region is tied together and how collaboration across county and state lines is really better for everybody. So when COVID hit, we had several tools we were able to lean on to more quickly pull together a regional response. The region had suffered from a number of large wildfires and particularly hard winters over the last few years, and we had practice pulling together an economic recovery response to those natural disasters. In 2019, also, we were able to, MCED assessed and learned from our response to those natural disasters. And as a result, we came out with several business resiliency guides, as well as a report that suggested ways the region could do better next time. So COVID hit, and we flipped open that report and started pointing businesses to the resiliency guides and went to work. So the first step was developing what we call the Mid-Columbia Economic Resiliency Team, which is our local version of a number of the teams that a number of our other presenters have talked about. So it's focused on supporting our businesses and employees. We have staff level participation from chambers, ports, county level economic development, key state agency reps, groups that work with our minority businesses, and other important partners like our Small Business Development Center. The large team right now is meeting weekly, and we also have a smaller group that's communicating a little bit more often to focus our response and make sure the region is ready for state and federal assistance. To bring additional order to the chaos, we've also stood up part of our website to be a clearinghouse for business and employee information. And we're also emailing a daily digest of news for the team. So I know that my email has been overwhelmed by new information for businesses and employees. And what we've been doing is really compiling that and sending that out once a day to really benefit everybody. So pulling the group together has led to partnerships being naturally created. For example, the executive director for our Small Business Development Center, who is pretty new in that role, he's become very important individual to all of our chambers and has been providing webinars right and left for everyone. Partnerships have also risen to focus on supporting PPE manufacturing locally. There's quite a lot of grassroots organization that's started around that. We're especially proud of HMB 50 is a group of local visionaries that's really stood up very quickly, a whole new business to create gowns for our healthcare workers. And we've also, another partnership that we've really been focused on too is also how we support our ag industry, as I mentioned, being a very key part of our economy. I also want to add that our regional resiliency team is a model that Oregon Governor Brown has rolled out, and this was something that Bob Parker mentioned. So it's this team approach has really been rolled out across Oregon with the support of her regional solutions staff. The different regions in Oregon benefit from having this governor's staff person who's a link to the governor's office and helps local communities interact with the state agencies. And our local regional solutions team member, Nate Stice, he's been really instrumental at helping establish our team, pulling partners together on different projects, and looking more forward down the line for us at a state level. He's really been acting almost as like additional capacity for MCED and for the region. He's been great. MCED also benefits from a strong network of economic development districts across Oregon. I think that's one of the other things that's been very valuable. In some ways, the EDDs are really set up to respond to this type of need, and we're well positioned to connect local communities with state and federal resources. Many of them are also gap business lenders and are used to working with challenging situations. So looking ahead at reopening, we are going to be focusing on the frameworks that Governors Brown and Inslee are setting up to help get our counties set up with the testing, the contact tracing, the PPE that we need so we can meet our public health needs and then reopen our businesses. That's our next focus. And we've been kind of like Katie talked about, some of our businesses are really going to be taking the lead at helping the state figure out how that reopening happens. We're also encouraged by the county by county approach that potentially could help with some of our very rural counties that there are some in Oregon that have no cases so far. And so how do we support at a county by county level the decisions to reopen? So those are kind of my opening comments. Thanks, Lauren.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jessica. What an exciting time to be stepping into the role of executive director for you. I send you my best wishes as you deal with this. So we're going to move into moderated discussion, and several people have sent messages in the attendee chat, and we've got a link up now for the 10-point economic action plan that Kate mentioned, as well as a white paper from the University of Oregon that Bob referenced. So go ahead and take a look there. I guess let's start with just a general question, and maybe Eric, you can take a stab at this first. But you work for a regional organization also, so I guess with this being a global disaster and certainly affecting all 50 states, how should governors work together? Are there opportunities for them to ensure through their coordination that the Western region is prepared for economic recovery, and what are the other ways that they can coordinate on either sharing of resources or technical expertise or messaging that you would recommend?
Well, I can just say I've worked a lot on regional, meaning multi-county and some state issues. And with jurisdictional boundaries, that can be difficult, and it's not typical to have that type of coordination, information sharing, even collaboration happen. So we do have the unusual circumstance here with COVID that is national in nature, and what we need to look for is those natural connections. And where urban areas touch one another, I'd use the example of Portland and Vancouver areas. That functions as a multi-state, two-state area that I'm very familiar with from that standpoint. We ought to try and accentuate the coordination for that particular region. You can't force it to happen where there are no natural connections, but there's a natural one. So looking for those types of areas, and there's always tri-state areas where states come together and touch noses. Those are the types of places where you can try and do more. Certainly, the opening and closing coordination aspect of this will continue to be huge, because you can't have a wide disparity going on between states, of one being totally open and the other one still locked down tight. So that's the starting point, but what we need to do is build on that from an economic development piece and not worry so much about the dollars and how they're spent within the state line, if you understand what I'm saying. Well, look for where we can do things for the region, and that's not the normal thinking, but these are not normal circumstances. I think we can benefit one another, scratch one another's back in trying to share resources and not being overly selfish about exactly where the money is spent on a boundary between two states. I've just shared. It's not a naturally occurring thing. You have to use this opportunity to make progress. I call it the 500 blanket rule in an emergency. If I call you up and ask for, hey, can I get 500 blankets, and it's Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, and you're going to give me 20 questions. In a disaster, if I call up on Sunday morning at 2 in the morning and say I need 500 blankets, you're delivering them, and you ask me if I need cots. So let's use the positive energy in this and leverage that to do something extraordinary.
Thanks. That's a good analogy, and I think that's a nice silver lining of this crisis. Does anybody else have comments they want to add on that?
This is Kate. I would just add, what we're seeing at the local level right now is communities are learning from each other really rapidly and trying things. And I think that's going to be true from state to state, governor to governor, is that we all don't have the perfect answer. So we're all going to learn from each other, try things, and try again. The other thing that I would say is that, we were on the phone with our Colorado Tourism Office yesterday, and they were talking about how travel sentiment down the line as people are still thinking about traveling. And of course, the ways they're thinking about traveling is going to be road trips in their cars. So we're going to be looking at much more regional travel. And so I do think that we certainly have to be communicating across our boundary lines, because that's probably how we're going to be flowing in the near future, is going to be within our regions. So those conversations are important.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Oh, go ahead.
Well, yeah, one thing that's happening that folks have probably heard about on the West Coast is that California, Oregon, and Washington have a Western States Pact that outlines a framework for reopening. It's not uncommon for the West Coast states to coordinate within coordinating on climate change and other issues. So I think that's an interesting development that we've got here, and it will be interesting to see how that continues into the future as we move through the reopening and into the recovery phase of this.
Great, thanks. Jessica, anything to add?
No, I think it's really been covered. Kind of what Eric was talking about is the two states for our region, especially coordinating, has been very helpful.
Great. Okay, we got a question from the audience about unemployment and the impacts on small businesses and when those people will be able to go back to work. I think in conversations that I've had with folks across the West, it seems like the Payroll Protection Program from SBA, which was intended to help keep people on small business payrolls, may not or likely will not have enough resources to help every business that needs it on the timeline that's necessary. I thought that was interesting on the slide that said that if a business closes for 3 weeks during disaster, it never reopens, and we've passed that mark already with this one. So I guess if we could talk a little bit about what are the other options for supporting small businesses that are trying to hang on that might not be able to access those federal resources, and if that fails and there's a wave of closures of those small businesses, how does that impact recovery plans, and what can communities do to repopulate those empty businesses in their communities?
This is Jessica. I can share some of the resources that we've seen for small businesses besides those federal dollars. As I mentioned, the economic development districts often have their own business lending programs. We've also been getting some support from Oregon State and some of our Oregon level foundations. With the Oregon Community Foundation has a small business stabilization fund that entities like ours have been able to apply for to support our communities. The different districts are going to have proposed to use those in different ways, but some of those are going to be grants or loans to businesses. We've also heard some of our here in Oregon, one of our rural counties, Gillum County, actually contributed some money to their local chamber to give out as grants. There are other large businesses that are contributing funds to entities like ours to give out as grants. And of course, traditional banks are coming up with their own programs. If there's still so much need and not enough money really for the businesses. So I'm not really sure what the answer is. If they were allowed to open up tomorrow, I think that many of them would struggle to bring everybody back on immediately just with the cash flow needs. I'll see what my other presenters want to say.
Thanks, Jessica.
This is
anybody else?
This is Kate. Our Office of Economic Development is creating a big kind of spreadsheet of other alternative resources to federal funding, so ones that are available local, ones that are available regionally, to try to fill some of that void, and also trying to partner with private organizations in the state to fill some of that gap funding. I would say the other piece of this is making sure that our business community and our public health community are working in lockstep to develop some strategies so that when we can reopen, we are ready to do so. One of the things that I heard out of La Plata County, which is a more rural county in Colorado, is we want to open once. so try to make sure that we have the systems in place that enable us to open and open well so that we don't have to go back and forth. So I think that that's a really important thing that we can be starting to do now, is starting to develop what some of those protocols are that might help businesses reopen once they are able.
Thanks, Kate. Anybody else?
Well, this is Bob. I think the reopening is going to be contingent, at least based on the information we've been seeing, discussions we've been having, both within the Institute as well as with our colleagues at Echo Northwest, on the capacity to test and contact trace. And so there's a lot of question marks out there about what happens after governors start relaxing the shelter-in-place orders and the extent to which people will begin to patronize businesses. And it's really unclear at this point how long that will take. I think a lot of economists are thinking about this. There's a team at ECHO that's doing work for Washington County, which is not a rural county, in Oregon, looking at the economic impacts. Right now, I think they're thinking about looking at them later this year, what it might look like in December based on a set of assumptions, thinking about what the risk factors are by industries using the National Industrial Classification System or the North American Industrial Classification System. So there's a lot of unknowns out there. Harvard published a report earlier this week, a roadmap to pandemic resilience, that really speaks to that. And what they're calling for is establishing a health corps, setting up a very significant testing and contact tracing. And they optimistically think that if that happened at scale, that things could begin to reopen by August. But that would take an unprecedented level of effort to move forward, at least something we haven't seen in the last 50 or so years.
This is Eric. I would just like to accentuate that open right, open once. That type of messaging is really key. That to keep that, to have just a major thing that people hear, it's like safety first, if you ever heard that phrase. Open once, open right, open, I guess it's open right, open once. Reiterating that and having that a key theme will keep people motivated and on board with what you're trying to do. And I think the other thing we have to watch is what's the disease trend that we're talking about. The earliest we can have a vaccination is 18 months. The fastest a vaccination has ever been developed is 4 years. So we need to probably get it out of our head that this is, I'm thinking about Bob's chart again. Think of successive waves going through our economies in the next couple of years. And it isn't just we've had an event, now we have to recover. We're going to have the major event and the successive events, even with good social distancing, good discipline, and trying to make the right decisions. As the CDC director mentioned, when flu season and COVID combine again in the fall, it's going to make that much harder for the medical community to respond. So it's not going to be one and done. We're in it for the long haul.
Thanks, Eric. All right, so I wanted to ask you all too. So we talked a little bit about how the federal stimulus and aid has been coming through in sort of a phased approach with different packages of stimulus, and that's ongoing. So I wanted to get each of your perspectives on, as we look into the next month and down the road over the next year, what are the groups or sectors or what should the targets of that aid be as Congress considers additional stimulus? Don't all jump in at once.
I'll jump in on this one, Lauren. And I think the reason you're hearing silence is because that's a very difficult question to answer, and it requires some value-based decisions that I certainly don't have the authority to make. And so if you look at Richard Florida's 10-point plan, I think he's optimistically talking about investment in airports and arts and so on, and that's all predicated on an assumption that people will be allowed to gather, will feel safe gathering. I work for an anchor institution, and my institute's been pretty heavily involved in recovery efforts for the University of Oregon, and it is going to be a different institution on the other side of this. The financial hits already have been substantial. I think this event's going to reshape higher education in some really fundamental ways. From the perspective of economists, at least the economists I've been talking to, it boils down to questions about should we be investing in basic industries, in traded sector industries, in innovation, research and development, to respark economies. If you read the Harvard report, they're talking about setting up basically a healthcare core, which might be an interim way to create jobs. And we had a conversation earlier this week with, I'm sure Jessica was on this, with Nate Stice, where he was talking about the governor's plan for reopening Oregon, and we were hearing from some of the rural mayors that they don't have the capacity to do the kind of testing and contact tracing that exists. So I think there's some pretty interesting questions that will emerge out of this, and how Congress responds will be interesting. I won't be surprised if an infrastructure bill comes through with this, and we look at strategies of federal investment to create jobs. There's clearly going to be a state and local government fiscal crisis. I don't think mentioned this in his initial remarks, but that's looming out there. There was not a lot of support for state and local governments in the first round in the CARES Act, and hopefully that will be forthcoming, because that will have a ripple impact on a number of other things. But part of what we're seeing is the inability of local planning offices to process permits, and it's not a mystery to anybody that we've had a housing crisis, affordability crisis throughout the West for actually nationwide for some time now, and part of it has been a supply issue.
Absolutely. Does anybody else want to jump in on that question?
Well, this is Eric, and I know the city of Seattle has already asked its departments to propose their 10% cut, and that is not going to be enough. I think Dayton, Ohio, was in the news yesterday saying they're taking an 18% cut. It is a reduction, and each jurisdiction community, those reductions will be representative of the values of those elected officials there. We're also just in the plain era of uncertainty, whether certainly we'll be in a recession, whether that transitions to a depression, or the other big economic issue, and one reason they're not afraid to pump the dollars into the system is deflation, even, which is greatly feared from that standpoint. So, the crystal ball is foggy. I call it the fog of COVID, the fog of virus. But we can't wait for that to clear up. We're just going to have to, as I mentioned, Bob mentioned, is be action-oriented and keep working on it and not waiting for things to become clear, because they won't be clear for a while.
This is Jessica. I'll just jump in. In addition to this, the local government, I know some of our legislators are looking also how to support tribal governments. And then one other that we've been, continuing to see how we can support our ag partners, and then manufacturing. Right now, a lot of our advanced manufacturing is still moving forward, but they are concerned about potential slowdowns coming.
Got it. Thank you. Kate, I wanted to come back to you. You were talking about the tactical and community response and your office's role in previous disasters. So I just wanted to flesh out a little bit how this crisis and its economic impacts are differing from the disasters that Colorado has come to expect, like fires and floods, and what parts of the disaster recovery playbook are still relevant? What parts are you having to reinvent for this crisis? And are there any lessons that you've been able to discern so far from the experience?
Yeah, I would say we've been throwing out a lot of the playbook from what we've learned in past events. Now, some of the fundamentals of making sure that you have a bunch of stakeholders who come to the table and are working together across sectors is still important. As I mentioned in my kind of intro, who leads that may look different in this event. And one of the biggest things about this event that is different from your typical natural hazard event, natural disaster event, is that it's not obviously impacting just one part of the state. It's also not destroying infrastructure, as in buildings and some of that hard and natural infrastructure in the state. What it is, the kind of infrastructure that it's impacting is our systems, and it's showing where there are fractures in those systems, our healthcare systems, our economic systems, and the challenges within that. So we are taking a fairly different approach to thinking about this challenge because of that. We are thinking about what our teams need to look like differently. But what I would say that we've been seeing is that resilient communities, and resilience has become the hot new buzzword, but it's still one of my favorite words, all still have some similar characteristics that enable them to rise to these challenges. And that is they're really socially connected. They have good, social capacity I'll call out an example in our state, which is Montrose, Colorado, where the city of Montrose has really good relationships with its business community. And they have really been navigating this well because they are in constant contact and communication with that community. And they had those relationships going into this event. And communities where there's a lot of transparency, particularly within local governments, where everyone really understands how the local government operates, those tend to be seeing some kind of more success right now in response and beginning to think about recovery. So there are some traits that still prove to be true through our response to any disruption. It's also local governments who are able to be responsive and nimble, where they have leaders across their organization who know their roles and are able to step up and perform those in these type of disruptive situations. So I think those things continue to be true, but the playbook and emergency managers are now a player in this. Public health has to lead the way, and that's very different for us. And like I said, it's different. It's a different look at infrastructure. It's infrastructure that is our systems.
I think Kate's absolutely right about that. We had a conversation with our regional and state economic development administration representatives yesterday, and one of the observations they were making is that that the playbook now needs to include partnerships between public health or the healthcare sector and economic development, which is not something that we've engaged in or that we've observed communities in Oregon engaging in.
Thank you, Bob. Eric, do you have anything to add from your experience in disaster recovery?
it's a good thing that we had all the planning following 9/11 that brought emergency management and public health together in a much stronger alliance that has suffered some due to the decrease in federal funding for public health in the last 5 to 6 years. I want to say public health has lost something like 55,000 public health staff throughout the United States just due to the decrease in funding. So we can expect those things to reemerge as an area of strength. So that's an opportunity. But I would agree, it need to be open to these new partnerships that can develop out of this and not be locked into the way we functioned in the past. And since I got the mic, I'd like to highlight one other thing. I'm going to send it to you, Lauren, is that it isn't up on my blog yet, but it's an article, Social Media Usage Reveals Recovery of Small Businesses After Natural Hazard Events. And basically, someone's developed an algorithm to be able to look at social media usage before disaster by small to medium-sized businesses and then look at it post-disaster. Maybe that's a tool that could be used in assessment. I'll send you the link and you can share it.
Great, thank you.
It's something for a university. It's way beyond my high school algebra skills. So.
That'd be great. Thank you, Eric. So a question from the audience is, what sort of economic recovery do you expect, how strong it will be, how soon it will start, and assuming that it's going to vary enormously by region, what areas do you anticipate will do the best and what ones will have a difficult time? So I guess if people want to take a stab at that, either looking at the West as a whole or within your states or even by sectors, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll jump in on that, Lauren. I'll keep going back to, I think the recovery is going to be really contingent on testing and contact tracing. I'm going to go back to 2008 in Oregon because that's the area I know the best. What we saw in Oregon, but Oregon has traditionally been a fairly low wage state, and recessions hit a little later and a lot deeper here typically. And in 2008, we had 10 frontier counties in Oregon that have population densities less than 6 people per square mile. And many of those counties, and Jessica certainly recognizes this, we're seeing unemployment rates that were pushing up towards 25%. So I think it is almost certain that rural areas, particularly frontier areas, are going to be hardest hit and deepest hit by this. And that's consistent with ongoing trends that were emerging long before this event. If you believe the new geography of jobs thesis that Moretti from Berkeley put together, looking at innovation hubs and tech communities, the data that I've seen so far suggests, not surprisingly, that communities that have strong tech sectors are least impacted, and that's one of the least impacted sectors. So I would imagine that we would be seeing the Seattles and San Franciscos and Bostons, et cetera, continuing to thrive at this. And I think that's an interesting societal challenge in a lot of respects in terms of equity issues nationally, the continued viability and vitality of rural places. And these are areas that we work really deeply on. So I think mid-size and large metros will probably be least impacted, although in a community like Eugene, I anticipate that impacts to the university are going to have significant impacts to our overall economy. The University of Oregon's our anchor institution, and we're already seeing job losses for the institution. We don't know what enrollment's going to look like, but the conventional thinking is it will drop off at least 15%. So I think mid-sized metros with universities will also be impacted in some fundamental ways by this.
Thank you. Yeah, that's there's so much uncertainty still with universities. Has Oregon decided whether they'll have classes on campus in the fall yet?
We have not. We've decided that we will be remote teaching during the summer, and I have to give props to our incident management team and our chief resilience officer for moving classes from traditional classroom settings to an online format within the space of 2 weeks, as well as all the faculty that are doing this. But I would say right now, I don't think so. And as a major state institution, athletics are a very big part. Right now, it seems highly unlikely there'll be any athletic events that occur this year. And Oregon football was kind of a big deal here in Eugene. So
I can imagine, yeah. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the opportunities for growth that you all have identified. Throughout the Reimagine the Rural West initiative, we've been focused on identifying opportunities for rural communities to diversify their economies or to grow their economies and create more of a stable economic base. And in that conversation, we've talked a ton about the opportunities presented by telework and remote work and home-based businesses that take advantage of the internet and better supply lines these days. So I guess, and we've come up with, we've shared some strategies for how rural communities can put those in place. Obviously, having a solid broadband infrastructure is essential, but then there's other things that states can do as well to encourage people and businesses to hire remote rural workers or to move to rural communities to do their job that's already empowered to be remote. So I'd be curious if there are any ideas among you all of how rural communities can really capitalize on the opportunity, such as it is, that might come out of this stay-at-home time of everyone's professional life.
Well, this is Eric, just real quick. We've been having, this is the opposite of rural communities, but having weekly teleconferences with larger employees in the Seattle metro area. I'm talking about like Microsoft, Facebook, Expedia, Google, IT, Expedia, who else was there? There's another one. And they recognize that they're not going to come back exactly the way they were before. They're also not super anxious to reoccupy their facilities. They're willing to function as they are and make sure that they open right, open once from that perspective. But they're looking at a much more of a dispersed workforce, and that dispersed workforce could be out in rural areas. And the biggest issue, as you identified, is connectivity, high-speed internet. And I know in my work with some of the wireless companies, the key to truly 5G high speed is having fiber at devices. And large cities like Seattle and other, they want to charge an arm and a leg per light pole that they hang a 5G transmitter on. A rural community could create a density as long as they had fiber and offer a real deal that would be attractive for workers where they can be anywhere and finally live someplace where they can afford the housing, have good quality of life, and that. So that is an opportunity, but it is a chicken and egg type of thing. It's the connectivity that will be key to making that happen. But I think it's going to make these larger IT-based companies more receptive to having a distributed workforce that's all right, not in a metro area.
this is Kate. I would just share that our Office of Economic Development has a location-neutral employment incentive program, and this program provides incentives to companies that for each remote worker that they allow, they become eligible for this incentive. It also includes a small pot of money for doing location-independent marketing for counties and communities. So that's some of what we're doing to kind of promote and incentivize.
And then in my remarks, I mentioned stuff like that. So that's a perfect example of trying to foster that behavior.
I'll just add that we've seen some of our rural communities that have already been trying to focus on improving their broadband and fiber capabilities, and I think this is just an opportunity to try to direct some more of a investment into those activities. I also see we've also been looking at what trainings can we help provide that help more of our small businesses really fully move operations to online or remote. So that's some of the things we're thinking about.
Thank you. And in addition to remote and telework, Eric, I think you also talked about onshoring PPE production in the United States. Do you have any advice or thoughts on how some of that manufacturing that we've come to expect from other countries might be impacted? In addition to PPE, I can think of a couple other examples that this crisis has made people maybe reevaluate. But what are the key strategies or first steps to think about where some of that manufacturing could move back to the U.S.?
Well, that type of manufacturing is not huge of factories. That's why I think it fits well in more of a small to rural type environment, and it's not a high skill type of position, so it could be there. I think working with congressional delegations, because there'll be federal pressures, and through various economic stimulus measures to bring that manufacturing back on board. I would just target that, probably at the state level, to work that with congressional delegations to get language into new laws promoting, whether it's given a tax break or whatever those types of incentives are, to bring it back. Or, there are extremely large manufacturers like 3M and others that might look to diversify their manufacturing out, and that would be another place to explore the opportunity, because they'll have the capital to be able to build smaller plants, and they may have be incentivized just by the goodwill to try and do that beyond the confines of their existing production facilities.
That makes sense. I think that seems like a good opportunity. Anyone else want to add in on that? All right, we're getting close to the end, so we have a couple of questions here in the queue from our attendees, and I just encourage everyone, if you've got any, now's the time so we can make sure we get to them. The first question we'll do, tourism is the lifeblood for many rural Western communities, but most of the businesses that cater to these tourists are very small. How many will be able to hang on until tourists come back? Maybe Kate or Jessica might want to take a stab at that first.
I don't have a crystal ball on this, but what we have received in data from some surveys is that most think that they will be able to hang on for 3 to 5 months of continued regulation and distancing. But once again, that's just based on self-reporting survey data.
I wish I had that crystal ball. I don't have a good answer.
Eric or Bob?
Oh, yes, we've been having a conversation about tourism and have been working pretty closely with Travel Oregon, our state tourism marketing organization. The the first problem is that their budget has been decimated because they are funded through transient lodging tax revenues, and obviously very few people are traveling, so there's no revenue coming into the state or regional destination marketing organizations. One of my colleagues shared with me that Oregon is coming up as one of the highest, rural Oregon is one of the highest search places in terms of travel, so there might be some hope that people want to go out to remote areas after things settle a little bit. Exactly when that will happen and whether it happens soon enough to preserve the tourism infrastructure, right? And my concern, particularly with our frontier counties, is that they can't hang on long enough, and by the time that things get better, the infrastructure that was serving travelers to those areas won't exist anymore and will have to be completely reestablished.
And that's Eric. I think, in baseball it's called, I'm not a big sports fan, but it's called small ball, base hits, not grand slam, home runs. And you got to forget the festivals or the Onion Festival or the Tulip Festival, whatever, the big money maker for the year. Those things are gone in the near term. And the good news about some of these smaller rural places, they don't need a lot to survive, but they need something. And I think probably going back, hopefully they have a database of who's been, who's visited, and do individual outreach, and really individual outreach, and marketing to people who have stayed with them in the past and appealed to their goodwill, of the fact that you're open, everything you've done to clean the place in between visitors, all those types of things, just to keep that trickle of visitors sustaining the existing businesses. So you can't swing for the fences. We got to just get small victories where we can get them, I think.
And to that point, Eric, some of my colleagues have done work on what we've been calling the new natural resource economy. And one thing we've observed is that people in very remote areas tend to be quite resilient in terms of finding a way to survive. And part of the issue that we were looking at was there a new equilibrium that was established after the Northwest Forest Plan was implemented more than 25 years ago, and what were people in former timber communities doing to survive? And as it turns out, things like picking mushrooms or small-scale agriculture or sustainable tourism, those kinds of things. And I think we'll see some of that begin to emerge as time goes on here.
Thank you. Switching gears a bit, another question is that many ISPs have been setting up mobile Wi-Fi throughout their communities in this attendees' rural region, but much of that is intended to be temporary. Are states incentivizing companies to keep that infrastructure in place on a more long-term basis? Do any of you have any insights on that question? Well, I think it's a great question and one that I might close with and ask you all to think about. To end on a positive note, are there any sort of creative solutions or partnerships of necessity or new ways of doing things that have emerged already from the circumstances of this crisis that as we move forward and get to the other side and get to recovery, that you hope to see remain in place? And maybe I'll have you answer in the same order that we presented in. So Eric first.
Well, the last one, I was in trying to engage people on regional issues and working together. It's totally invitational. There's no way you can compel individuals and organizations to work with you or work with one another collaboratively. So I always say, just go where there's energy. You invite, you don't exclude. No one is too small to be involved. Don't be afraid of many voices, making it more difficult, because I think that's where partnerships can emerge. And like I said, go where there's energy. If someone's not interested, you can't make them be interested. Move on and go where people are interested in trying to work together and be able to share in their ideas. You have to be willing to compromise. And that, again, the larger you get, the harder it is to compromise. So one of the opportunities, small communities are networks of volunteers, and so they're good at working together. So hopefully you don't have those types of attitudes that you might see in larger metropolitan areas. So you just have to get out there and work it.
Thanks, Eric. Bob, any final thoughts?
Well, we did some interesting work with the city of John Day last year, and John Day is a very rural place, and their city manager, I think, was looking at an impending fiscal crisis for them where they simply didn't have the economic base to sustain the city organization. And he took a very creative approach. We put together an investment prospectus for them that I posted a link to. And instead of doing a traditional economic development plan or strategy, he put together an investment strategy. And one of the things he started with was, and I thought this was quite innovative, was to use city funds to build greenhouses where he is growing produce, the city's growing produce, and selling it to their local grocery store. So I think those kinds of sort of reimagining local economies, I think, can be strategies to try and retain local money, create more sustainable food systems, more sustainable economies.
Great, thank you, and thanks for sharing that link as well. Next, Kate, any closing remarks or thoughts about good things that have come out of this that you hope stick around?
Yeah, I think a really important thing that we've learned and is exciting in many ways is that we really can move quickly and try things in the face of change. So businesses are rewriting their business models overnight, and while this is not ideal, they are proving how adaptive they are. And local governments are willing to try new ways of operating right now. And I mentioned this before, but I think that we are really beginning to recognize how critical our business community is as a partner in all of the conversations that we have. They are a cornerstone of so many of our communities. But this willingness to kind of adapt and think quickly and try and maybe fail and try again, it's a mentality that will be important because things are changing rapidly in the world. And so we can maintain those, particularly in government. I'm trying to preach it at the state, and I think we're doing a pretty good job of being that responsive.
Thank you, Kate. And Jessica, the last word will be with you. No pressure.
I appreciate all the things Kate just said. I agree. I'm hopeful in how innovative our businesses, our governments, all of our partners have been working together. I know we have a history of working together in the region, but I'm also seeing partners that haven't traditionally been at the table coming together now and working really quickly to find solutions. And that's just been hopeful for me.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment as well. Well, I want to thank you all so much for giving some of your time. I know you're all very busy working on different aspects of economic development in your communities, and so we appreciate you taking some time to share what you've learned so far and your recommendations and strategies to help other folks in the West so that we can all learn from one another as we navigate this new era. I wanted to just briefly mention that tomorrow we'll be having another webinar at the same time, 11 to 12:30 Mountain, looking more specifically at the rural health challenges associated with coronavirus. And we have a really awesome panel that we're looking forward to of folks from Blaine County, Idaho, which was one of the early coronavirus hotspots in the United States, and they had at one point the highest rate of infection in the country, but they've rounded the corner and are now looking ahead to the next phases of managing the outbreak. So they'll be sharing their experience and things that they learned along the way, and what they're looking at doing as they consider reopening. And it should be a really interesting conversation. We hope that you'll tune in for that one as well. If you have any feedback or suggestions or comments that you want to share with WGA for our Reimagine the Rural West initiative, you are always welcome to contact me. My email address is ldinino@westgov.org, and we hope that you'll continue participating and stay tuned for other events coming up in the series. Thank you very much.